Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
History has a way of concealing truths beneath layers of narratives shaped by the victors, leaving gaps and mysteries that demand our attention. Among these forgotten chronicles lies the complex and often overlooked story of the Black natives in Colonial Virginia, indigenous peoples with African ancestry who played a crucial role in the early American landscape. Their presence was undeniable, their culture vibrant, and their impact significant. Yet over time, they seemed to vanish from the historical record. What happened to these communities? How did colonial policies, systemic racial classifications, and forced assimilation contribute to their disappearance? The answers are hidden within the folds of history, entangled in the intersections of race, colonial expansion, and the emergence of a rigid social hierarchy designed to erase their existence. Long before the English set foot on the shores of Virginia, indigenous tribes flourished, maintaining intricate societies, spiritual traditions, and agricultural expertise that sustained their civilizations. With the arrival of enslaved Africans in 1619, new dynamics emerged, intertwining the fates of Africans and indigenous peoples in ways that colonial powers sought to suppress. Intermarriage, shared resistance against European oppression, and the merging of cultural practices created a unique population, one that colonial authorities found inconvenient. As laws hardened, the distinct identities of Black natives were deliberately erased, forcing them into racial categories that did not acknowledge their dual heritage. The story of their disappearance is not one of mere coincidence, but rather the result of calculated legal, social, and political maneuvers that sought to redefine race and power in colonial America. To understand this historical erasure, we must delve into the early interactions between native tribes and African arrivals, examine the shifting racial classifications imposed by colonial lawmakers, and explore the deliberate policies that sought to fragment communities of mixed ancestry. Their story is one of resilience, struggle, and forced invisibility, a tragic yet enlightening piece of America's hidden past. When the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, they entered a land already occupied by diverse indigenous nations. The Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of tribes, dominated the region, engaging in trade, warfare, and diplomacy with European settlers. These native groups had experienced waves of contact with Europeans for over a century, and their survival strategies evolved with each new encounter. The introduction of Africans into this setting added another layer of complexity to the already shifting balance of power. Initially, Africans and natives found common ground, as both groups were subjected to European exploitation. They shared similar understandings of kinship, land, and resistance to foreign domination. Enslaved Africans who escaped into the wilderness often found refuge among native tribes, forging deep bonds that resulted in intermarriage and cultural exchange. This phenomenon was not limited to Virginia. Throughout the Americas, African and indigenous populations formed alliances against European settlers, creating unique Afro-Indigenous communities that blended traditions, languages, and survival strategies. In colonial Virginia, African men who escaped for plantations found solace among native tribes, who viewed them as allies against the common oppressor. The integration of these fugitives into native societies was not merely an act of charity, but also a strategic move, as these alliances strengthened indigenous resistance against European encroachment. Some Africans married into native families, adopting their customs and contributing to tribal economies and warfare. Over time, a new generation of Black natives emerged, individuals who embodied both African and indigenous ancestry, carrying the legacies of two powerful but oppressed peoples. The early colonial period was marked by fluid racial boundaries. Africans could initially earn their freedom, own land, and even intermarry with Europeans and natives. However, as Virginia's plantation economy grew, so did the colonial elites need to create a rigid racial hierarchy that would justify slavery and the expropriation of indigenous lands. By the late 17th century, laws were enacted to differentiate between racial groups, establishing a legal framework that would facilitate the oppression of both Africans and indigenous peoples. One of the most significant legal shifts occurred with the passage of laws that defined race through the lens of European superiority. The 1662 Virginia law of partis sequitur vent rem declared that a child's status followed that of the mother, meaning that children born to enslaved African women were automatically enslaved, regardless of the father's status. This law ensured that mixed-race children of African descent remained in bondage, effectively erasing any legal recognition of Black Native identity. Additionally, anti-miscegenation laws forbade marriage between Africans and Europeans, but they did not explicitly mention Indigenous peoples. This omission reflected the colonial government's initial uncertainty about how to classify Black natives. However, as racial classifications became more stringent, Black natives were increasingly grouped with Africans rather than with Indigenous communities. Laws such as the 1705 Virginia Slave Code reinforced this racial divide by legally defining anyone with African ancestry as Negro and stripping them of any Indigenous identity they may have held. These policies had devastating consequences. Black natives who had once been part of Indigenous communities were forced into the legal and social category of Negro, denying them access to tribal lands, cultural heritage, and political recognition. Over time, many Indigenous communities distanced themselves from their African relatives to avoid falling into the same legal category as enslaved Africans. This deliberate separation, driven by colonial laws, contributed to the erasure of Black Native identity in Virginia. As racial lines hardened, the colonial government employed various strategies to dismantle Black Native communities. One of the most effective tools of erasure was land dispossession. Indigenous tribes who had once accepted Black natives as members found their lands increasingly encroached upon by European settlers. As native lands were confiscated, many indigenous groups faced pressure to assimilate into European society or relocate further west. For Black natives, this often meant either being absorbed into the African American population or facing exclusion from both Black and Native communities. Christian missionary efforts also played a role in the disappearance of Black natives. Mission schools sought to civilize Indigenous children by erasing their traditional languages, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs. Black Native children, often classified as Negro by colonial authorities, were either forced into slavery or absorbed into African American communities, losing their Indigenous heritage in the process. By the 19th century, the combined effects of legal racial classifications, land dispossession, and cultural assimilation had nearly erased the visible presence of Black natives in Virginia. Many individuals of mixed African and Indigenous ancestry were either forced to identify solely as Black or were absorbed into white society if they could pass for white. Those who attempted to maintain their Indigenous identity faced legal battles, social ostracization, and exclusion from tribal roles that increasingly prioritized European-defined notions of racial purity. The disappearance of Black natives in colonial Virginia was not a natural occurrence, but the result of deliberate policies aimed at erasing their identity. Colonial authorities feared the unity of Africans and Indigenous peoples, recognizing the threat they posed to European hegemony. By enforcing racial classifications that ignore the existence of mixed heritage communities, lawmakers ensured the fragmentation of these groups and the loss of their historical legacy. However, history is not immutable, and the stories of Black natives are not entirely lost. Today, descendants of these communities are reclaiming their identities, piecing together fragmented histories, and challenging the colonial narratives that sought to erase them. Their resilience serves as a testament to the endurance of both African and Indigenous heritage in the face of systematic erasure. By acknowledging and honoring the history of Black natives in colonial Virginia, we take a step toward restoring their rightful place in the broader narrative of America's past.